Hello, everyone. Welcome again to another episode of Legal Lunch Byte. I'm thrilled today to be hosting Isaac Stonefish, CEO and founder at Strategy Risks. He's a China expert, deep expertise. We've interacted quite a bit before, and I really appreciate his perspective. So, Isaac, thanks for taking the time to be here. Please introduce yourself and tell us about your China cred.
Thank you for having me. Isaac Stonefish, CEO of Strategy Risks, a geopolitical risk and advisory firm. I started going to China, more than 20 years ago now. I spent a summer in Xinjiang in northwest China in high school, and then a summer in Tibet. Studied Chinese literature in college, worked as a literary agent in Beijing, as one does, for a few years before switching to journalism. Spent about 7 years in China total, and then covered the geopolitics and the political economy of China from DC for a while. Wrote a book called America Second about networks between China and the United States and also networks globally, and then started my firm several years ago now.
Excellent. So a lot going on. Obviously, this is if we didn't have the election year coming right now, there's always a lot going on between the U.S. and China. I know there are big things happening in China this month with the plenum happening. There are just so many things coming out. The U.S. and China are so big that there's always news. So let's start talking about this turmoil surrounding the U.S. election and what that's going to mean for companies with large operations in China.
What people have started realizing is that the world is a lot more unpredictable than they thought. I think you could really make the serious case that things have always been quite confusing and chaotic, but there was this overconfidence that I think many in the world are now losing. And the head spinning changes we've seen over the last couple of days and weeks with Trump and the assassination attempt and Biden and the debate and the idea, which used to be the realm of right-wing conspiracy theory, that a shadowy cabal was actually running the country, and then more of a realization of Biden's ill health than I think a lot of us were prepared for, has really raised two issues vis-a-vis U.S. companies with operations in China. One is a sense that they really need to understand what Trump's China policies are, because he's a lot more likely to win than he was, say, a month ago. And the second is that companies need to really look long and hard at their China exposure and the geopolitical risks that they're facing, and make sure that they have a plan in place for what's almost certainly going to be a turbulent few months and a turbulent few years.
How would you say companies are maturing? I was just in a meeting a few minutes ago talking about this issue. How are companies maturing in their viewpoint on geopolitical risk? And when did you even start hearing the word geopolitics in your professional life? And when did it become such a massive buzzword among all companies doing business internationally?
It was really niche until COVID. And that sparked the idea that supply chains and international affairs, and the idea that for many was crazy until it happened, that countries would withhold exports and imports based on geopolitical concerns. All of that started raising the idea. And then we saw a big shift in US-China policy in roughly 2018, with the removal of Xi Jinping's term limits on his chairmanship, the sense that China was actually threatening US exceptionalism and US primacy, and then also the concentration camps in Xinjiang and the idea that this old Maoist system wasn't really dead, but was being reinvigorated with new trappings. That really awoken the idea of geopolitics for many companies vis-a-vis China. The war with Russia, Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, reawoken that globally. And where we are now is we don't know if those two other wars are isolated wars. Think of the Spanish Civil War in the 30s, or if they are precursors to what will become another global war, a World War III, in a similar way that the Japanese invasion of China in the early 30s became part of World War II.
Fascinating. That's really interesting take on history and on global conflict generally. I'm always asked the question, and I like to ask others the question as well, is what is the likelihood of some conflict spilling over into the Taiwan Strait or in the South China Sea? And then, of course, we know what that would mean for supply chains globally. But what are your thoughts on that? If I can pin you down to a percentage on likelihood that we could have a conflict significant conflict that would stall or hamper global supply chain movement in and around Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, what would you say the likelihood is in the next 5 years?
So China has already started to invade Bhutan. And I'm smiling. It's a very serious story, but it gets almost no attention. And then you spend some time on the New York Times, Carnegie Endowment, foreign policy, and realize, oh, this is something that's being tracked and people know about. It's just not gotten broad attention. So if we broaden the aperture and say, what are the chances that China becomes an aggressor and starts invading its neighbors? Well, it's 100% because it's already happening. If we look at the scenario of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, I think there's, broadly speaking, two different levels. There's the all-out China declares war on Taiwan, or perhaps war without fully declaring it, but the US goes in, Japan goes in, and that is World War III. The odds of that are still hopefully quite low. I would put them at still under 10%. The odds of a limited invasion, perhaps akin to Russia's 2014 invasion of Ukraine and its seizing of Crimea, of Beijing, say, taking the islands of Kinmen and Matsu, which are just miles away from Xiamen, or of assassinating a Taiwanese politician, or of causing a large brownout in Taiwan, or in having some sort of sleeper attack and then stopping. Those odds, I say, are quite high. And depending on what you define as an act of war, what you define as a serious disruption of supply chains and tensions, I'd put anywhere between 20 and 40%.
Yeah, extremely interesting thinking about those tactical incursions or things that are more designed, more along the lines of saber rattling, but can really impact the way people are doing business and how people are thinking about that risk. So let's turn to due diligence then, because that's a big part of my world in the business transactions that I do, looking at how companies should think about, really, where do you even start in due diligence? How broad do you need to go? How many years back? What in your mind, what are the kinds of things that companies should be looking at when they're looking at appraising due diligence for any kinds of operations in China, whether that's their own greenfield investment or maybe it's a joint venture with a partner in China?
The two pieces we think are the most important, and we do a lot of work in both these areas, are regulatory risk and business risk. Regulatory risk is, does this violate the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which restricts the ability to import into the United States from Xinjiang? Is this working with a sanctioned company? Is this working with a company that, for another reason, falls in the negative category for U.S. investors, U.S. regulators, other people in the U.S. system? One big piece of this, which we think is growing pretty rapidly, is keeping people aware of partnerships with entities that are either part of the Communist Party or closely linked to the party, because those could pose future regulatory risks. So right now, it's not illegal for a U.S. company to partner with the People's Liberation Army. And one can imagine tensions worsening and there being laws and restrictions that ban that. And at the very least, outside of regulatory risk, working directly with the People's Liberation Army does pose PR risks. As Jonathan knows, and as folks who follow China closely know, the PLA is very different from most militaries around the world. It is not an independent entity. It is the armed wing of the Communist Party. So the PLA would be like if Ohio, say, its National Guard was part of the RNC or the DNC. It's an arm of the party. It's not independent. Its job is not to defend China. Its job is to defend the Communist Party. So it's just a different political structure, and it acts in China differently as a result. The second piece for due diligence is business risks. It's, does this person that I'm potentially partnering with, or does this company I'm potentially partnering with, have a high likelihood of being snared in a corruption campaign? Or do they have bad environmental policies? Or is there a lot of chatter that they steal IP? Because outside of what the US government can do to a partner in China, the bigger risk is what the Communist Party can do or what their competitors in China can do. And so making sure that even though a company could be very independent from all these political risks, they still could be polluting in a local Chinese river. And you can find that information and you can realize that before you get dragged into some sort of environmental catastrophe because of your Chinese partner.
That's great. So you have these two big headings. Is there any other way that you, when you're explaining China exposure to your clients, or when you're speaking on this, how do you classify generally these different areas of China exposure?
So we have methodology called the Strategy Risks Index, which concretely quantifies this exposure. And we walk through that in great detail with clients. But we also say there's a difference between real exposure and perception of exposure. And so a great example there is the difference between Huawei and Lenovo. So Huawei is very blacklisted. It's very known to be an arm of the Chinese state, even though it's not technically an arm of the Chinese state. And then you have a company like Lenovo, which is roughly a quarter owned by Chinese state entities, but is still fairly prevalent in US government institutions and across the country and across the world. And so from a reputational risk perspective and a regulatory risk perspective, it's less of a problem to have a partnership with Lenovo or to have Lenovo integrated into your business operations than it is Huawei, because the issue is often less which company has a higher China exposure and more what is the perception of that in DC, in Brussels, and in Tokyo.
What is the perception? I'm always curious to hear people. I track government things, but I think you have a better tack on this. What is the perception right now, let's say on both sides of the aisle, with regard to China? We say it's fairly unified. Are there different approaches to the way they're looking at, de-risking versus decoupling from China? What are your, and I know, of course, the Chinese government leaders are very carefully tracking U.S. elections this year, and they probably would favor one outcome over another. Can you comment on any of that?
Yes, I think the Chinese government would strongly favor Trump winning. I think it's fascinating to watch him say things like Taiwan has to pay more for its own defense. And I also think it's fascinating to watch him as an outlier, not only among the Democratic candidates, but also more starkly among the Republicans. J.D. Vance has very different stated views on China than Trump, as does Haley, as does DeSantis. Trump looks at these things differently. Look at his comments on TikTok, his desire to, quote unquote, make a deal, his pushing back on Japan and South Korea for not paying enough to house US troops. These would be big, big wins for China. And so we're in this funny situation where many of Trump's advisors and confidants and many people in the Republican Party, arguably more vociferously than the Democratic Party, want policies that are tougher on the Communist Party, but Trump himself doesn't necessarily want them. And Harris is a bit of a cipher on China. She's spoken a lot less on it than a lot of other leading Democrats. I think we can assume that she would be, if she does take over the nominee from Biden, be assertive, though not to the same level that he is, which represents more progressive influences there. The progressives tend to be more dovish on China. But Beijing made the mistake of very actively meddling in the election in 1996 with Clinton and Dole, and they've been more subtle and more sophisticated since then. They certainly have preferences, but they want American friends of theirs, both corporates and individuals, to advocate for Beijing on their behalf. So far, they haven't done anything explicit that shows them very directly meddling. A lot of things on the internet, a lot of things through proxies. We don't expect them to be more aggressive than that, but these are unprecedented times.
Excellent. Isaac, we're at time. 15 minutes goes quickly, and certainly have enjoyed catching up with you today and hearing your perspective. I look forward to catching up with you again soon in the future.
Thanks for the great questions and for